Disgrace to this country, President Trump snapped at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, his voice cutting through the chamber like a gavel meant to silence. But disgrace is a funny thing. Sometimes it belongs to the one shouting. For over 240 years, America has seen its share of scandal, but never had 78 million eyes watched a sitting president lock horns with Jasmine Crockett, a lone congresswoman holding nothing but a single, blood-stamped envelope. That day in room 214 was not just politics. It was a collision between raw presidential power and unshakable proof. And in the next 46 seconds, the most powerful man in the nation would be forced to stand still, while the truth walked right up to his face. The heavy double doors of room 214 swung open with the kind of confidence that didn't just enter a space, it claimed it. President Trump strode in like he owned not just the room, but the building, the city, the country. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, his crimson tie hanging like a flag at half-mast for decorum. 4 Secret Service agents flanked him, 2 to each side, while aides trailed behind, carrying leather folders and clipped whispers. The cameras surged forward on their mechanical necks, lenses tracking him as though they, too, had been ordered to stand at attention. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he let the silence bend toward him, scanning the faces at the long mahogany table like a general surveying a battlefield. His eyes locked briefly on her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, sitting alone at the far end, her hands folded, her posture straight but unyielding. There was no smile on her face, no attempt at small talk, only a stillness that felt deliberate, almost defiant. Trump leaned into the microphone, the metal arm creaking under the weight of his approach. His voice came out sharp, each syllable designed to pierce and bruise. Congresswoman Crockett is here to stir chaos, not truth. The words ricocheted off the marble walls, finding their mark in the ears of the press gallery where reporters' pens twitched like triggered traps. For a moment, Jasmine didn't move. Then slowly she raised her head, meeting his gaze with eyes that didn't blink. Her voice was cool, almost conversational, but laced with steel. "If I wanted chaos, Mr. President," she said, "I'd just replay your last term." The chamber erupted, not in shouts, but in that dangerous murmur that sweeps through a crowd when someone has dared to say the thing everyone was thinking, but no one had spoken aloud. A few staffers stifled smiles, others pretended to shuffle papers, but the air had already shifted. It was no longer the president's room. It was a ring, and both fighters had just stepped inside. Trump's jaw tightened, the practiced politician's grin faltering for a heartbeat before snapping back into place. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness, as if the extra seconds were an act of dominance. "Cute," he said finally, his tone dripping condescension. "I expected more from a freshman congresswoman. But then again, low expectations have a way of making mediocrity look like courage." Jasmine didn't take the bait. Instead, she leaned back slightly, the faintest shadow of a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "It's funny you mention courage," she replied, "because it takes a particular kind of bravery to sign your name to certain things, especially when those signatures tend to reappear in places you didn't intend." The subtle emphasis on signatures was enough to draw every camera's focus toward her. Trump caught the shift, and his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "If you have an accusation, make it," he said. The words clipped, meant to project authority, but instead betraying a thin thread of irritation. "Oh, I don't need to make it," Jasmine said, her tone now the calm of a surgeon before an incision. "You already have." Her hand rested lightly on the leather folder before her, the one with the blood-red stamp across its seal. Trump glanced at it, then back at her, his eyes narrowing. "Another stunt for the cameras. How original." "It's not a stunt," Jasmine said evenly. "It's a record." The room's temperature seemed to drop. One of the reporters in the gallery leaned forward, pen hovering, while a C-SPAN cameraman adjusted his focus. Even the members of the committee, usually content to let the president command the spotlight, found themselves watching her instead. Trump sat back in his chair, feigning disinterest, but his fingers tapped against the table in an uneven rhythm. "You think waving a piece of paper makes you right? I've been dealing with people like you my whole life. Loud voices, thin facts." Jasmine let him finish, then tilted her head slightly. And I've been dealing with men like you my whole life. Loud voices, thin skin. The reaction was instantaneous. A ripple of suppressed laughter from the gallery, a few audible intakes of breath from the press benches. Trump's face flushed, but he held his ground. "Watch yourself," he said, low enough to sound like a warning, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I am," Jasmine replied, "very closely. And what I see is a president who's more afraid of what's in this envelope than of losing the next election." The two locked eyes across the table, neither blinking. It was the kind of stare that turns seconds into weights, each one heavier than the last. Outside the building, Washington traffic roared past as usual, oblivious to the quiet war being waged within these four walls. Then, without breaking eye contact, Jasmine slid the envelope forward across the polished wood. It moved slowly, almost ceremonially, the sound of its paper edges whispering against the table louder than the collective breath of the room. It stopped exactly halfway between them. Trump didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned in just enough to let the microphones catch his voice. "If you think you can scare me, Congresswoman, you're in for a disappointment." Jasmine's reply was immediate. "Mr. President, I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to remind you that no one, not even you, is above the truth." A beat of silence followed, the kind that isn't empty but charged, like the pause before a lightning strike. Somewhere in the back, a camera clicked, and just like that, the first strike had landed. Not with a shout, but with a sentence that cut deeper than volume ever could. The room was no longer neutral ground. It was a battleground, and both sides knew it. Trump leaned back slightly, a smirk curling across his face. The kind of smile meant to say, "You don't scare me," without using words. Then, with deliberate slowness, he leaned forward again, elbows resting on the table, fingers steepled under his chin. His voice was calm, almost casual, but it carried the weight of a man used to bending rooms to his will. "You think a letter scares me? I've signed thousands," he said, pausing to let the number linger like a boast. "Most are worth more than your career." Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she reached into the leather folder before her, and with the same composure one might use to place a chess piece, drew out the envelope. It was heavy, thick, its corners creased from handling, the deep red stamp glaring against the pale paper like a warning light in a dark room. She set it down in the center of the table, not shoving it, not sliding it aggressively, just placing it there as if it had always belonged in that exact spot. Her fingers tapped the seal once, twice, 3 times. The sound was soft but deliberate, each tap like the tick of a clock counting down to something irreversible. "This one isn't about value," and she said, her tone measured, steady, impossible to interrupt. "It's about intent. Yours." The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. A beat of silence followed, thick enough to press against the walls. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked as a journalist shifted forward, pen poised above paper. The network cameras instinctively zoomed in on the envelope, the lens adjusting to capture every fiber of its surface, every ridge of the embossed stamp. The red mark, bold, centered, caught the overhead light, sending a faint gleam toward the far end of the table where Trump sat. He glanced down at it but didn't move his hands. His smirk tightened, his jaw flexing once. "Dramatic," he said finally, his voice dropping to something almost too quiet for the microphones. "But you and I both know theatrics don't win hearings." "This isn't theater, Mr. President," Jasmine replied, her eyes locked on his. "Theater is when people pretend. This," she tapped the envelope again, a single sharp sound, "is real." One of Trump's aides, seated just behind him, leaned forward as if to whisper something into his ear. Trump didn't acknowledge the movement, didn't break eye contact with Jasmine. "If that's so real," he said, "why wait until now to bring it out? Why not go straight to the press?" "Because the press can tell a story," Jasmine said, her voice sharpening just enough to draw blood. "But in this room, the story becomes the record, and you can't erase the record." The silence that followed wasn't the respectful kind. It was the wary, bracing kind. The kind that comes when everyone in the room realizes they've crossed an invisible line and there's no going back. Even the sound tech in the corner, who'd been quietly adjusting levels for the broadcast, froze mid-motion. Trump shifted in his chair, his hand brushing the microphone base as though deciding whether to lean in again or let the moment hang. Finally, he spoke. "You think that little piece of paper changes anything? I've been accused of everything under the sun. Presidents get attacked. It's part of the job. This," he gestured at the envelope with a flick of his fingers, "is just another cheap shot." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a prosecutor studies a witness who's just given away more than they intended. "Then you won't mind if we read it into the record," she said. Her hand slid the envelope a fraction closer to the committee's document camera. The movement was small but unmistakable, an invitation and a challenge all at once. The committee chair cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. The members on either side of him leaned forward in unison, their gazes fixed on the object between the two adversaries. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was a loaded weapon sitting on the table, and everyone knew the first person to open it would decide the next chapter of this hearing. Trump finally broke eye contact, leaning back and letting his chair creak under the shift of weight. He clasped his hands together, knuckles whitening as he spoke. "Read whatever you want. Just remember, lies have consequences." "And so does the truth," Jasmine countered. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The calm in her tone made the sentence land like a hammer. From the press gallery, the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters filled the air, capturing the tableau. The President of the United States sitting rigid on one end of the table, a congresswoman on the other. The space between them occupied by an envelope that had suddenly become the most important object in Washington. No one in the room dared to break the moment. Even the marble walls seemed to lean in, listening for what might come next. Outside, the city kept moving. Tourists snapping photos of the Capitol dome, aides hustling between offices, sirens wailing somewhere far away. But inside room 214, time had slowed to the rhythm of 3 soft taps on a red-stamped envelope, each one echoing a little louder than the last. And in that suspended second before the next move, everyone watching, in the room, on television, across the country, understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a letter. It was about whether the truth could still stand its ground when power was staring it down from across the table. The pause broke not with a gavel, but with Trump's voice, sharp, fast, and deliberately dismissive, as though the longer the envelope sat there, the heavier it grew. Fake stationery, forged signature, desperate stunt. He fired the words in quick succession, each one clipped, like a boxer throwing short jabs to keep an opponent off balance. His hands stayed folded, but his eyes locked on Jasmine with the intensity of a man who had spent decades turning accusations back on the accuser. A ripple moved through the gallery. Not shock exactly, but recognition. The phrase forged signature had been one of Trump's most reliable shields in past controversies, a ready-made line to plant doubt in the public mind. But today in this room, that line was about to run into something it couldn't deflect. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't even look down at the envelope again. Instead, her hand moved to the control panel embedded in the table before her. Without a word, she tapped a button. The wall behind the committee lit up, the bland beige replaced by a high-resolution projection. At first, it was just an image of a handwritten signature, bold and familiar, sprawled in thick black ink across official White House stationery. Then another appeared beside it, and another. 6 in total, aligned in 2 neat rows. The first column, authenticated signatures pulled from federal archives, each linked to separate policy documents, public letters, and ceremonial proclamations. The second column, a single signature copied from the very letter that lay in the envelope between them. The resemblance was immediate and undeniable. The slant of the capital D, the loop on the T, the pressure on the pen strokes, all identical. The forensic analysis watermark in the corner confirmed what the naked eye could already see. Jasmine let the image hang there, refusing to speak until the silence itself was leaning toward her. Then she finally broke it. 6 matches, she said, her voice steady but caring, each syllable measured to land cleanly. 6 lies exposed. Which one do you want to admit to first? The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, quiet at first, then rippling outward. Some in the gallery leaned forward, their eyes darting between Trump and the screen. Others scribbled furiously, sensing the shift. The committee chair's knuckles whitened against the table edge, but he didn't intervene. Trump's jaw flexed, the muscles tightening and loosening under his skin. His lips pressed into a thin line, but his gaze didn't drop to the images. He kept it locked on Jasmine, as though looking away would be the same as conceding. Seconds ticked by. The air felt heavier. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. Less dismissive, more controlled, but edged with steel. I don't have to dignify forgeries with a response. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. That's the beauty of signatures, Mr. President. They don't need your dignity. They're already yours. A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere near the press bench. Trump's fingers began tapping against the table, an uneven rhythm betraying what his words tried to conceal. His lead counsel shifted in his seat, clearly itching to object, but Trump raised a hand slightly, a signal to stay put. He wasn't ready to retreat to legal jargon yet. Instead, he leaned toward the microphone, his shadow cutting across the table. Congresswoman, do you understand what happens to people who make false accusations against a sitting president? His voice was low, almost intimate, but carried to every corner of the room. Jasmine matched his lean, the distance between them shrinking until the letter on the table was framed perfectly between their faces. Do you understand what happens to presidents when the accusations aren't false? She asked. The gallery murmured again, louder this time, a sound like the slow build of an oncoming storm. On the screen, the signatures remained frozen, silent witnesses to a battle that was no longer just verbal. Trump's gaze flicked briefly to the images, then back to her. You've got nothing but ink on paper and a political agenda. It won't hold up. Then let's put it to the test, Jasmine replied, tapping the envelope with her forefinger once. The sound echoed through the microphones. Right here, right now, read it into the record. Let America decide what holds up. The committee chair shifted uncomfortably but still didn't interrupt. Cameras adjusted, zooming in on the letter, then on Trump's face, then on Jasmine's. The live feed's split-screen view was already being replayed in control rooms across the networks. Trump didn't reach for the letter. Instead, he sat back slowly, exhaling through his nose, the kind of measured release that said, I'm not finished. His smirk tried to return, but it didn't land the same way it had 10 minutes ago. Jasmine didn't gloat. She kept her eyes on him, her hands folded loosely, as if she had all the time in the world. And in that moment, with the truth illuminated in 6 matching signatures behind her, and the president choosing silence over denial, it was clear to everyone watching, the counterattack had been met and turned back. The hearing wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. Trump's eyes narrowed just slightly, the kind of micro-expression that only those trained to read faces would have caught. He leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing beneath his weight, and let a slow, deliberate smirk return to his lips. It was the look of a man who had decided brute force wasn't the only weapon in his arsenal. His voice, when it came, was smooth. Too smooth. Why don't you tell America about the PAC donors you've met behind closed doors? The question sliced through the air like a hidden blade. It wasn't a direct strike against the evidence. It was a strike against her integrity, her right to stand there at all. The room shifted. A few heads turned toward Jasmine, the suggestion hanging heavy, as if impropriety might be waiting in her shadow. Trump's gaze stayed fixed, studying her face for even the smallest flicker of discomfort, the telltale sign that his bait had found its mark. But Jasmine's composure didn't crack. She allowed the faintest of smiles to touch her lips. Not the wide, triumphant grin of someone cornering an opponent, but the quiet acknowledgement of a move she had seen coming. She leaned forward slightly, enough for her voice to carry with the kind of clarity that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. I will, she said evenly, right after you explain why $8 million traveled the world in 48 hours, just to land in Dubai under your son's name. For a split second, it was as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The words hit like a sudden drop in altitude. That moment in a plane when your stomach lurches and your grip tightens. The reaction was instant, Reporters' pens froze mid-stroke, aides' eyes darted to one another, cameras pivoted toward Trump. The figure, 8 million, wasn't just big, it was specific, and specificity has a way of cutting through denial like nothing else. Trump's chair shifted back a few inches, the faint scrape of its legs against the marble floor amplified by the room's tension. His body leaned away, but his eyes never left hers, still locked in that challenging stare. It wasn't retreat exactly, but it was movement. And movement meant the hit had landed somewhere tender. The smirk was gone now, replaced with a tautness around the mouth that hinted at restraint, calculation, the measuring of his next move. In the gallery, the murmurs began, a rolling undercurrent that no gavel could entirely silence. "Dubai?" someone whispered sharply. "48 hours?" another murmured, the disbelief in their tone matching the disbelief flickering across the faces of several committee members. On the live feed, producers in network control rooms were already cueing graphics, prepping lower third banners with the words 8 million, Ardash Dubai, Trump GR in bold capital letters. Trump leaned forward again, this time with a sharper edge in his posture, his elbows planting firmly on the table. "That's a fabrication," he said, each word hitting the mic with clip precision. "A made-up number, a made-up story, another lie from a congresswoman who's made a career out of them." But the defense didn't land the way his team might have hoped. The image of him leaning back moments earlier, caught on multiple cameras from multiple angles, was already being spliced into live coverage alongside Jasmine's accusation. Context in that moment was less about his denial and more about the timing of his reaction. Jasmine let him speak, didn't interrupt, didn't even shift her posture. When he finished, she simply asked, "Would you like me to pull up the bank routing logs now, or would you prefer I wait until after your counsel advises you?" Her voice was a scalpel, calm, precise, designed to cut without the mess of shouting. The room exhaled collectively, the kind of breath people don't realize they've been holding until the moment passes. Trump's counsel leaned toward him again, whispering something low and urgent, their lips close to his ear. The president's eyes narrowed, his jaw setting in a way that suggested he was biting down on more than just words. One of the committee members, seated to Jasmine's left, glanced at the chair, a silent question about whether to intervene, but the chair didn't move. This was no longer about procedural order. It was about the momentum in the room, and right now, that momentum was in Jasmine's hands. Trump straightened once more, shifting his tone back toward bravado. "Go ahead, Congresswoman," he said, his voice carrying a forced nonchalance. "Let's see this so-called proof you've got, because when it falls apart, and it will, the whole country will see what a fraud you are." Jasmine inclined her head as if granting permission for the game to continue. "When I show it," she said softly, "and it holds, the whole country will see what you are." There was no laughter in the gallery this time, no gasps, just a heavy humming silence. The kind that signals everyone present knows the next move could decide more than the outcome of a hearing. It could decide the legacy of a presidency. Trump's hands rested flat on the table. The faint tremor in his fingers, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to those watching closely. Jasmine reached down to her folder again, fingers brushing the next set of documents, the ones she had kept sealed until now. And as her hand closed over them, the room seemed to tighten, waiting for the reveal, waiting for the next hit, waiting to see if the man who had once commanded the stage could withstand another blow. The bait had been cast, and whether Trump realized it or not, he'd already bitten down. From the second row, a figure rose slowly, the creak of the chair cutting through the tense air like the first crack in ice before it breaks. Eleanor Finch moved with deliberate steadiness, each step carrying the weight of decades in service, in the gravity of someone who understood the cost of speaking in rooms like this. Her silver hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her simple navy jacket bore no pins, no signals of party allegiance. Only the quiet authority of a woman who had been behind more doors than most in Washington could dream of. She approached the microphone with a pace that dared anyone to interrupt her. The chair glanced down at the docket, then back up. "Please state your name for the record," he said. "Eleanor Finch," she replied, her voice calm but resonant, the kind that settled into the corners of the room and stayed there. Former senior White House correspondence officer, 1994 to 2016, serving under 4 presidents from both parties. The credentials hung in the air for a moment before she turned her gaze directly toward the giant projection of the signature comparison still glowing on the wall. She didn't flinch. "That handwriting," she said, lifting her hand to point at the match from the envelope, "is his. The pressure on the S, the tail of the T, unmistakable." Before the words could fully settle, Trump's voice cut in, sharp and impatient. "You worked for me once, Finch. Funny how you remember my pen but not your paycheck." His smirk returned, but it carried an edge now, less confident and more defensive, as though hoping the jab might steer her off course. Eleanor didn't miss a beat. She turned her head just enough to look at him, her expression unblinking. "I remember both," she said evenly, "and one was cleaner than the other." A ripple moved through the gallery. Not the laughter of amusement, but the kind of low hum that comes when a blow lands and everyone knows it. Trump's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, but Eleanor continued before he could interrupt again. "For over 20 years," she said, "I handled correspondence of every level of sensitivity, condolence letters, diplomatic notes, executive orders. I know the cadence of a pen in motion, the way a hand leans when writing under pressure, the exact slant that makes each signature unique." She gestured toward the enlarged images behind her. "These are not forgeries. They're identical in every meaningful way to authenticated documents signed by President Trump during his term." Trump leaned toward his mic, his tone clipped. "You mean the term when you worked in an office 3 floors down from me and barely saw my face?" Eleanor nodded once, unfazed. "That's correct. But I saw your handwriting every single day, and unlike some things in Washington, ink doesn't lie." The line landed like a hammer on stone. Jasmine's eyes flicked toward Eleanor, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Not of allegiance, but of shared understanding in the face of power that assumed it could outweight, outtalk, or outspend the truth. The chair cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pulling the entire committee's focus toward the witness stand. "Ms. Finch, for the record, are you willing to testify under oath that the signature on this letter is that of President Donald J. Trump?" "I am," Eleanor said without hesitation, "and I am prepared to swear to that in any court, anywhere, under any penalty for perjury." Trump shifted in his chair, one hand rising as if to wave her off, but then stopping mid-gesture, fingers curling back into a loose fist on the tabletop. "You're chasing a narrative," he said, his voice dipping low, "and you don't even see how you're being used." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, the faintest trace of steel in her voice now. "Mr. President, I've worked for leaders who were remembered for their service, and I've worked for leaders who were remembered for themselves. History will decide which one you are, but my job is to tell the truth about what I know. And I know this is your handwriting." The last words came down like a final stamp, and for a moment the room froze around them. The camera zoomed in on her face, then cut to Trump, who sat perfectly still, jaw working as though chewing on a response he hadn't yet decided how to deliver. From the back, a reporter's voice whispered into a recorder, "Finch says it's his, on the record, under oath." The words would be on every network within the hour, but here, now, in room 214, they were still raw, still hanging like a guillotine's blade. Jasmine didn't speak, didn't need to. She simply folded her hands on the table, the envelope still sitting between her and the president, now backed by the voice of someone who had spent decades safeguarding presidential words, and who had just confirmed that this one was his. The hearing moved forward, but it was no longer the same battlefield. One side had just been reinforced by a witness whose credibility couldn't be spun away in a single soundbite. And if Trump had thought the envelope was just paper, he now knew it was a weapon, one with more than one hand ready to wield it. The low hum of conversation was cut short when the overhead screen flickered, the static buzz drawing every eye to the glowing frame. The seal of the state of New York filled the display, bold and unmistakable, before dissolving into the image of a woman seated behind a polished oak desk. Her presence was immediate, her posture squared, eyes level with the camera. "Letitia James, Attorney General of the State of New York." she began, her tone calm but carrying the weight of an official who had walked into more legal battles than most would dare. My office authenticated the letter in question 7 weeks ago. A collective inhale rippled through the room. It was one thing for a former staffer to vouch for a signature. It was another entirely for a sitting attorney general to attach her name and her office to its authenticity. But before the impact could fully settle, Trump leaned into his microphone, his voice dripping with that familiar cocktail of sarcasm and derision. "Ah, yes," he said, each word drawn out. "The attorney general who sued me for sport." His eyes flicked toward the camera as though speaking to her directly, but also to the millions watching, spinning the jab into a performance. Letitia didn't flinch. If anything, the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. Not of amusement, but of someone who had heard far worse and triumphed anyway. "And won," she replied without missing a beat. Her tone was cold, surgical, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. "Shall we continue?" The exchange landed like a stone in still water. A sharp drop, then expanding rings of realization moving through the chamber. Even members of the committee who'd been silent shifted in their seats, their attention locked on the screen. Letitia adjusted a file in front of her, the motion deliberate, letting the camera catch the state seal stamped in red across the top. "We conducted a multi-tiered forensic examination," she continued, "ink dating, handwriting analysis, and comparative verification against no fewer than 12 authenticated presidential documents from Mr. Trump's tenure. All tests confirmed an exact match. There is no ambiguity." Trump's fingers drummed against the tabletop, the rhythm uneven, betraying an agitation his face tried to mask. "Your office has been after me for years," he said, his voice tightening. "This is just another chapter in your witch hunt. You've made a career out of chasing headlines with my name in them." Letitia's gaze never wavered. "Mr. President, my career has been about applying the law equally, whether the name is yours or anyone else's. The difference is, most people don't give me this much material to work with." A muffled chuckle escaped from somewhere in the gallery before being swallowed by the tension. Jasmine watched from her seat, her eyes flicking between Trump's increasingly rigid posture and Letitia's steady calm. This wasn't just a statement, it was a dismantling, brick by brick, of the narrative Trump had tried to build around the letter. "Attorney General James," the chair interjected, "for the record, are you stating that your office verified both the authorship and the date of the letter?" "Yes," Letitia replied, the single syllable carrying more weight than a paragraph could. "The ink is less than 6 months old. The signature is an exact match to verified documents. And the content, as you know, was not written in isolation." She paused just long enough for the implication to sharpen. "It references actions that, if proven, constitute not only ethical violations but potential criminal conduct." Trump shifted forward, hands flat on the table, his voice rising. "This is absurd, baseless. You're trying to criminalize politics." "Politics doesn't interest me," Letitia said, her tone as flat as tempered steel. "Crimes do." The words hung there, solid and immovable. The air in the room felt denser, as though every molecule had been pulled taut by the gravity of what was unfolding. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, the flicker in his eyes, the taut line of his mouth. Before cutting to Jasmine, who sat silent but watchful, letting the exchange between the president and the attorney general build its own momentum. Trump tried again, this time leaning into the well-worn defense of attacking the process. "You don't have jurisdiction here. This is a congressional hearing, not a New York courtroom." "True," Letitia said evenly, "but the law doesn't stop at state lines, and neither does the truth." A murmur rose from the press bench, the kind that signals a line destined to replay in evening broadcasts. The chair gave a single nod. "Attorney General James, we appreciate your time and your statement. This will be entered into the record." Letitia inclined her head once, the image on the screen flickering before fading back to the seal of New York. The screen went dark, but the weight of her presence remained, pressing against the room like a shadow that wouldn't lift. Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the now empty screen, as if willing it to return so he could have the last word. But it didn't, and for the first time in the hearing, the silence that followed wasn't just tense. It felt like an unanswered question hanging in the air. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. The battlefield had shifted again, and this time, the blow had come from outside the room, carrying the full force of an office that couldn't be brushed off with a smirk. She turned her attention back to the table, her hands moving with deliberate calm as she unlocked her tablet. A single swipe, and the chamber lights dimmed slightly as the massive overhead screen behind the committee flared to life. What appeared first was clean, clinical, a white background, sharp black lines and bold red arrows connecting box after box in a branching web. Numbers sat inside each box, precise to the last cent, each timestamp stamped in military format. The image was a forensic map of movement. Not people, but money. It looked less like a business chart and more like a top-secret military diagram. Arrows traced a path from a Delaware-based PAC account to a holding company in the Bahamas, then to a corporate shell in the Seychelles, and finally to a private banking institution in Dubai. At each stop, the red arrows glowed just a little brighter, as if the path itself were heating up under scrutiny. Trump leaned forward in his chair, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing at the display. "Lines and arrows don't prove a crime," he said, his voice low but cutting, the kind of statement designed to plant doubt. "They're just graphics." Jasmine didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed on the screen, one hand tracing a line from the second to the third box. "Then," she said evenly, "explain Project Crimson in your internal ledger." The shift was instant. Trump's eyes flicked toward his lead attorney, a quick, almost involuntary movement. The counsel leaned in, whispering something too low to catch, but whatever it wasn't an answer. Trump straightened but didn't speak. Jasmine tapped the screen again, and the diagram zoomed in on the final leg of the transaction. The red arrow thickened, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat, pointing directly to an account labeled only with a corporate alias. Below it, in smaller font, was the name of the account holder, Donald Trump Jr. The room tightened as if the air itself had condensed, every ear straining to catch what might follow. 48 hours, Jasmine said, her voice still calm, but now infused with the rhythm of a prosecutor laying out a case. That's how long it took for $8 million to leave a domestic PAC, cross 3 international jurisdictions, and land here. She tapped the Dubai account box, and it pulsed on the screen. No taxes, no disclosures, no oversight. The gallery stirred. Reporters exchanging glances, pens scratching furiously, camera lenses adjusting for a closer shot. Committee members who had sat back during earlier exchanges now leaned forward, some frowning, others expressionless but intent. Trump finally spoke, though his tone lacked its earlier bite. "I have no knowledge of any Project Crimson. I don't even know what that is." "That's odd," Jasmine replied, finally turning her gaze toward him. "Because according to your own financial oversight filings from last quarter, the ones your team submitted under penalty of perjury, Project Crimson was flagged internally as a high-priority operation, the very same ledger that lists this Dubai account as the final deposit destination." Trump's hands curled slightly against the tabletop, fingertips pressing into the polished wood. "I sign a lot of reports," he said tersely. "I can't be expected to remember every line item." Jasmine let the silence that followed work for her. She didn't rush to fill it, didn't let him escape into a back and forth. Instead, she tapped the screen one final time. The diagram dissolved, replaced by a scanned image of a single ledger page. Across the top, in black ink, was the phrase Project Crimson, Private Reserve. And at the bottom, in unmistakable penmanship, was a signature identical to the 6 still projected earlier on the sidewall. The juxtaposition was surgical, his signature on the damning document framed beside the forensic map of the money's path. The evidence didn't just tell a story, it locked the doors to every exit he might try. "You're looking at your own signature on a document tied to the largest unreported transfer from a political pass in the last election cycle," Jasmine said, her voice steady but caring. "If this is just lines and arrows, then your name is just ink. Is that your defense?" Trump didn't answer. His attorney's hand twitched on the table, but Trump didn't give him the nod to speak. The president's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, his lips pressing into a tighter and tighter line. The chair cleared his throat, but even he seemed reluctant to cut the tension. Outside the hearing room, Washington might still be spinning at its usual pace, but inside everything had narrowed to the space between one woman, one man, and the truth that sat lit up in front of them. Jasmine finally stepped back from the control panel, letting the image linger. "We can debate politics," she said, "but numbers leave fingerprints." Her words slid into the silence like a blade into water, sharp but without splash. Trump remained still, his expression unreadable, but his knuckles pale against the table. The financial kill shot had landed. Whether it was fatal remained to be seen, but it had found its target. From the third row of the public gallery, a sound broke the stalemate. Not the metallic scrape of a chair or the impatient shuffle of paper, but a voice. Low at first, trembling, then firm enough to carry across the marble chamber. "My husband died," the woman said, "because he lost his Medicaid." Heads turned. Cameras pivoted, their lenses catching her as she rose slowly to her feet. She was in her early 60s, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun streaked with gray, wearing a plain black cardigan that hung a little loose on her frame. Her hands clutched a folded piece of paper, crumpled from being held too tightly for too long. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight ahead, her eyes locked somewhere between the witness table and the committee dais. "It took 6 days," she continued, her voice breaking once but never stopping. 6 days watching him in our living room, in pain so bad he could barely breathe because we couldn't afford the ambulance. They took his coverage after the federal expansion got pulled back, said it was budget, said it was necessary." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Trump, not with fury but with the weary clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Trump leaned toward his microphone. "Tragic," he said, his tone measured but dismissive. "But not my doing." The words landed like cold ash. For a moment, the woman just stood there, absorbing the impact. Not because she hadn't expected it, but because the bluntness of the denial confirmed something deeper. Her chin lifted a fraction, and she opened her mouth to speak again. But Jasmine moved first. Turning in her chair to face the woman directly, Jasmine's eyes held steady. "When money hides in shadows," she said, her voice low but caring, "people die in the light. That's on all of us, including you, Mr. President." She didn't raise her tone on the last part. She didn't need to. The quiet indictment cut through the air sharper than any shout. A ripple passed through the room. Not applause, not outrage, but a heavy, collective intake of breath. The kind of sound that meant the words had found their way past politics and into something more human, more dangerous. The woman in black tightened her grip on the paper in her hands. "I don't know what a PAC is," she admitted, "or a shell company, but I know what it feels like when someone rich signs a paper and someone poor disappears." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't sit down. The cameras lingered on her face, capturing the deep lines carved there, not from age alone, but from years of holding everything together without enough. In that image, the story shifted. It wasn't just Jasmine versus Trump anymore. It was the lives caught in the space between them. Trump's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Perhaps there was nothing he could say without sounding like an argument against grief itself. Jasmine turned back toward the committee, her voice now softer, but no less direct. "This hearing isn't just about signatures or transfers. It's about what happens when power chooses secrecy over responsibility. And while we argue over who signed what, people like her husband are gone. Not because there was no money, but because the money went somewhere else." In the press section, a reporter lowered her pen. Sometimes a sentence didn't need to be written down. It wrote itself in the air. The widow finally lowered herself back into her seat, the paper still clutched in her hand. Her shoulders shook once, twice before she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Around her, strangers shifted subtly closer, not to speak, but to be there. For a long, unbroken stretch, the chamber stayed silent. Not the tense silence from earlier, not the hushed calculation of political maneuvering. This was different. It was the silence that follows when someone has said something so raw, it leaves no space for rebuttal. Jasmine didn't break it. She let it breathe, let it do its work. Trump sat back, his face impassive, but his posture tighter than before. Even if he wouldn't acknowledge it, the balance had shifted again. Not because of a legal point or a headline, but because the conversation had been dragged out of the abstract and into the living room of an ordinary American family. It was the kind of punch you couldn't counter with a smirk. The heavy double doors at the rear of the chamber opened without fanfare, but the energy in the room shifted the moment they did. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped inside. Dressed in a fitted black blazer over a white blouse, she moved with deliberate steps, her heels striking the marble floor in a rhythm that felt both measured and unstoppable. She didn't glance at the press, didn't scan the gallery. Her eyes went straight to Jasmine Crockett. Without a word, she approached the witness table, coming to stand at Jasmine's right shoulder. The cameras reacted instantly, swiveling to capture the two of them framed together. One seated, grounded, holding the battlefield she'd already fought over. The other upright, arriving like a second wave. Trump's mouth curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. He leaned toward his microphone, the sound catching the slight scratch of static before his voice came through. A socialist tag team. Perfect. The words rolled out slow, deliberate, baiting the air for a reaction. AOC didn't blink. She angled her head just enough to look at him over the microphones. Better a socialist, she said, each word clean and deliberate, than a sellout. The reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath from some corners of the room, a murmur of agreement from others. In the press section, pens began scratching again, knowing they'd just been handed a quote that would play on repeat across the evening news cycle. Trump leaned back, an eyebrow lifting in mock amusement, but his gaze stayed fixed on them, calculating. "You two rehearsed this?" he asked, the tone almost playful, but hiding a barb. Jasmine didn't bother to look at him. "You don't rehearse the truth," she said. AOC slid a manila folder onto the table in front of Jasmine. "Additional documentation," she said simply, loud enough for the mics to catch, "from the New York Bureau of Financial Enforcement." Her voice was steady, without the inflection of drama, but the placement of the folder. Right there, inches from the envelope already sitting between Jasmine and Trump, was pure theater in its precision. The whispers in the gallery swelled again. The image was powerful. Two congresswomen standing shoulder to shoulder, their combined presence drawing the room's attention like gravity. Jasmine opened the folder with the same careful control she'd used before, revealing a new set of printed records. The top page bore the bold black title, Overseas Transaction Cross-Reference Report. Trump's smirk faltered for the briefest second. He leaned toward his attorney, muttering under his breath. The lawyer's lips moved quickly in return, but Trump's eyes remained on the documents now sliding under the committee's document camera. The overhead screen flared again, this time displaying a bank authorization order with a familiar corporate alias at the top. Underneath a date, 49 hours before the Dubai deposit Jasmine had already exposed, and at the bottom a signature, the same signature. Trump's voice rose a notch, sharper now. "You think two signatures make a case? You're grasping." AOC didn't even turn her head toward him. "We think two signatures make a pattern. And patterns," she said, "are what prosecutors call evidence." The murmurs in the gallery were louder now, punctuated by the faint click of a photographer's shutter. Jasmine tapped the document on the screen with her pen. "This order," she said, "was authorized less than 2 days before the funds appeared in Dubai. The issuing bank is registered to a company tied directly to Trump International Ventures." Trump's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. AOC folded her arms, her stance angled toward the room, not the man across the table. "We can talk ideology all day," she said, "but at some point you have to talk facts. And the fact is, no one moves $8 million that fast without knowing exactly where it's going." Trump finally spoke, his voice lower now, more contained. "You're manufacturing a scandal. You don't care about the truth. You care about headlines." Jasmine turned her head toward him, her expression as still as it had been at the start. "Sometimes, Mr. President, the truth is the headline." The silence that followed was different from earlier. Less shocked, more certain. The image of the two women at the table had crystallized into something the cameras couldn't look away from. Trump shifted in his chair, his hand drumming against the tabletop, but he didn't interrupt again. AOC stepped back slightly, letting Jasmine take the center again. The reinforcements had arrived, and the effect was undeniable. The room wasn't just hearing evidence anymore. It was watching the formation of a wall that power couldn't easily push through. And for the first time in the hearing, Trump looked like a man measuring how much fight he had left in him. From the far end of the gallery, a slim woman with short auburn hair stood up. Elise Warren, a name familiar only to those who'd followed the deeper, quieter currents of political intrigue, moved with the measured pace of someone who understood that every step toward the witness table was a choice she could never take back. Her hands held a small silver USB drive, glinting under the overhead lights. Without a word, she passed it to the clerk, who looked at the chair for confirmation before inserting it into the committee's media system. A dull click sounded from the chamber, speakers followed by a faint hum of static. Then came the voice, deep, unmistakable, heavy with the confidence of someone used to giving orders and being obeyed without question. Use whatever it takes. Handle it quietly. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were measured, deliberate, carrying that cold clarity that comes when a directive isn't meant for debate. The chamber froze. For a full 2 seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. Then the voice returned, sharper this time, as if responding to someone in the room with him. I don't want her in front of a mic again. Handle it. Trump shot up in his chair, his palms slamming against the table with a sound that made the microphone shudder. Deep fake, he roared, his voice cracking through the tension like glass under pressure. This is AI garbage, a fraud, a cheap political trick. The denial was loud but not instant. And in that half-second gap before he spoke, cameras had already caught the flicker in his eyes, that involuntary recognition that precedes any defense. Jasmine didn't flinch. Without looking at him, she tapped her tablet. The overhead screen changed, the waveform of the recording appearing in sharp blue spikes. Beside it, in red, another waveform, this one from a verified recording of Trump's voice during a White House press briefing. Independent analysis, she said, her tone clinical, from 3 separate labs. The University of Michigan's Speech Integrity Unit, Stanford's Audio Forensics Lab, and the FBI's own voice matching software. She tapped again, and the 2 waveforms overlapped perfectly on the screen. 98.7% match. That's not deepfake, Mr. President. That's deep trouble. A gasp rolled through the gallery, followed by the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. The match percentage glowed in bold numbers above the graph, impossible to miss on the live feed. Trump's attorney leaned in, speaking quickly into his ear, but Trump waved him off with a sharp gesture. His voice, when he spoke again, was lower but no less forceful. You can pay any lab to say anything. This is a setup, a witch hunt. The same game you've been playing since day one. Jasmine finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. The labs didn't know whose voice they were analyzing. The files were submitted blind, labeled only as Sample A and Sample B. They matched them anyway. For the first time, Trump didn't respond right away. His eyes shifted just briefly toward Elise Warren, who now sat quietly at the end of the witness table, her hands clasped in her lap. That glance alone was enough for several photographers to zoom in, their instincts telling them this was the shot that said more than any headline could. The chair cleared his throat. Ms. Warren, he said, for the record, can you confirm the date and circumstances of this recording? Elise's voice was steady. March 12th, 2024, recorded during a closed-door strategy meeting at Mar-a-Lago. The recorder was mine. He didn't know it was on. Trump's head snapped toward her. You were in that room? I was in a lot of rooms, she said, her gaze holding his. You just never noticed the ones who weren't clapping. The sentence landed like a quiet detonation. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't shift. She let the moment hang, the tension thickening like smoke. The chair addressed the record again. Ms. Warren, you're prepared to submit this under oath? I already have, she replied, and I've given full copies to the FBI and the Department of Justice. Trump's hand tightened on the edge of the table. This is political theater, he said, his voice low but shaking with something harder to hide. You people will do anything to destroy me. No, Jasmine said, her voice calm but cutting. We'll do anything to protect the truth, even when it whispers. And in that chamber, On live television, in front of millions, the whisper had just turned into a roar. The gavel didn't strike, but the room had already shifted into verdict mode. The chair's voice carried over the hum of tension. We will now call for a procedural vote to determine whether a formal investigation into the president's conduct will be opened. The words fell like a stone into deep water, a simple sentence, but the ripples it sent through the chamber were immediate and unstoppable. Names were called one by one. Most followed the expected path. Democrats voting in favor, Republicans against. But then, halfway through the roll call, the script cracked. Representative Clark. Aye. The single syllable snapped heads toward the Republican bench. A seasoned lawmaker from Pennsylvania, Clark's record had been one of unwavering party loyalty. Yet here he was, eyes steady, voice clear, breaking rank. Then another. Representative Vaughn. Aye. The murmurs began. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens racing, eyes darting between the faces of those about to vote. By the time the clerk reached the fifth Republican who crossed the aisle, the room was no longer a chamber. It was a pressure cooker. The weight of decades of political expectation strained against the moment. The final tally made it clear. 7 Republican members had joined the call to open an investigation. The number might have been small in proportion to the whole, but in the language of politics, it was seismic. Trump's head turned slowly, scanning the faces of the defectors. His expression was a mask, but his eyes burned. Traitors, he said, the word low enough to be caught by the mics but heavy enough to land like a slap in the space between them. The Republicans he targeted didn't flinch. Some looked down at their desks, others stared straight ahead. One, Clark, met his gaze head-on, his jaw set in the resolve of a man who had just crossed a bridge that would burn behind him. Jasmine didn't turn to face Trump. She kept her eyes forward, her posture unshaken, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. When she spoke, her voice carried not just to him, but to every lawmaker in the room and every viewer on the other side of the lens. Sometimes loyalty to truth, she said, means betrayal to lies. The line hit differently than any cross-examination or fact-check. It wasn't legal argument. It wasn't political rhetoric. It was moral clarity laid bare, a quiet assertion that the room could feel in its bones. Trump leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the shift of his weight. His smirk was gone. In its place was a tight line across his mouth, the look of a man calculating not victory, but survival. His fingers drummed once, twice against the table, but there was no retort ready. Nothing that could meet the weight of what had just happened. The clerk read the final tally into the record. Motion to open a formal investigation passes. The words rang out in the chamber like a bell signaling the end of one round and the start of another. No one applauded. There were no cheers. The atmosphere was too heavy, too loaded with the knowledge that this was not an ending, but an escalation. The Republicans who had voted aye sat still, aware of the headlines already being written about them. The Democrats didn't smile, knowing how far there still was to go. And Jasmine, she simply closed the folder in front of her, the red stamped envelope still lying untouched in the center of the table. Her hands rested on it briefly, not possessive, not protective, just steady. She didn't look at Trump. She didn't need to. The cameras, as if they knew, didn't linger on the chair or the tally board. They stayed on her, on the stillness that wasn't surrender, but something far more dangerous to an opponent. Patience. The kind of patience that says I can wait for the next move, because I already know how this ends. Trump finally broke the silence with a long exhale, his eyes flicking toward his counsel. But in that breath, the balance of the hearing had shifted again, this time not because of evidence or theatrics, but because enough people in the room had decided the cost of silence was greater than the cost of defiance. The silent verdict had been delivered, and it carried more weight than anything a gavel could declare. The corridors outside room 214 were a crush of reporters, cameras, and the sharp smell of hot equipment under bright lights. The air buzzed with the static of 100 questions shouted at once. Staffers tried to carve a path through the chaos, but the crowd only surged tighter as word spread that the president himself was about to speak. Trump emerged from the committee wing flanked by aides, his crimson tie catching the glare of the flashbulbs. He walked straight to the podium, hastily set up under the watchful eye of the press corps. The seal of the presidency gleamed on the front. He gripped both sides of the lectern, leaning in with the familiarity of a man who'd turned outrage into theater for decades. This, he began, his voice booming over the hum, was not a hearing. It was a witch hunt staged by radical liars who hate this country. And at the center of it all, a traitor in a tailored suit? He didn't have to say Jasmine's name. Everyone knew who he meant. The insult landed heavy, calculated for sound bites and headlines. Reporters jostled forward, mics lifted. Across the hall, Jasmine Crockett had just stepped into view, still in the navy suit she'd worn during the hearing, the red-stamped envelope clutched loosely in her hand. Without hesitation, she crossed the press scrum and stopped just a few paces from Trump's podium. "If telling the truth makes me a traitor," she said, her voice level but cutting through the din like a clean blade, "then I wear that title with honor." The press snapped to attention, cameras pivoting as if choreographed. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Trump turned his head toward her, eyes narrowing. He let the silence stretch for a beat before a crooked smile crept onto his face. "We'll see," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that still carried through the microphones. "How long honor pays your bills?" The words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in condescension. For a split second, the noise of the hallway dulled, as though the moment had drawn a vacuum around them. Jasmine stepped closer, closing the gap to less than an arm's length. She didn't raise her voice, but the steel in it made the space between every syllable feel deliberate. "Long enough," she said, "to make sure you can't sign another one like that letter again." Her eyes flicked down to the envelope in her hand, then back to his. The gesture was small, but the implication was loud enough for the entire press corps to hear. She still held the proof, and she wasn't done with it. The crowd erupted, reporters firing off questions, photographers shouting for them to hold still, the flurry of shutters capturing the tableau. Trump, still gripping the lectern, held her gaze for a moment longer before looking away, scanning the crowd for a softer target. Jasmine didn't move. It was a standoff without raised voices or gavel strikes. Fought in the space between two people who understood the real battleground wasn't the hearing room anymore. It was the narrative that would follow them out of it. Trump had his podium, his loyal base, his practice sneer. Jasmine had the envelope, the evidence, and a nation still replaying her words from earlier that day. Slowly, she stepped back from the press scrum, letting the questions rain toward him. She didn't need to linger. Her line had landed, and she knew it. The cameras followed her retreat, catching the faintest curve of a smile. Not satisfaction, but the recognition of unfinished work. Trump turned back to his podium, the smile on his face tighter now, less sure. His words, when he resumed, were louder, harsher, but they felt aimed at filling the space she had just occupied, rather than claiming it for himself. And somewhere in that hallway, as the cameras kept rolling and the flashbulbs burned, it was clear to everyone watching, whether they loved her or hated her, that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the last frame of the day, a frame where the president looked like a man trying to regain control, and Jasmine Crockett walked away like a woman who'd already taken it. In the end, the battle in room 214 was never just about a letter, a ledger, or a voice on tape. It was about the cost of silence and the courage it takes to stand when standing alone feels impossible. Truth will not always roar. Sometimes it will arrive in whispers, in folded paper, in the steady gaze of someone who refuses to look away. And when it does, the measure of who we are is not in how loudly we speak, but in how fiercely we guard what is right, even when the world tells us to sit down. If this story lit a spark in you, don't scroll past it. Hold it, share it, speak it out loud, like, comment, and pass it to someone who still believes truth belongs in the sunlight, not buried in shadows. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where lies meet their reckoning and no voice stands alone. Hit the bell, because the next chapter isn't comfortable, it's unflinching, and it might just change the way you see those who hold power. This story is a fictional dramatization, drawn from the echoes of real struggles, real courage, and real consequences. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental or deliberate, as a mirror for public reflection. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't given, it's fought for. This is Harrison Stories.